languages.
Matthew Rossano is our keynote speaker for the end of the day. Professor Rossano holds his degrees from the University of Dayton and his PhD from UC Davis. He's a professor of psychology at Southeastern Louisiana University. Matthew Rossano kept me up late last night with a generous distribution of his published papers from his website. He's devoted himself productively to the intersection of religion, ritual, and the evolutionary development of cognition and community. That's my own formulation. I didn't stay up quite late enough to learn exactly how much I'm leaving out in that. But today we'll hear from him on ritually shaping the imagination, humanity in 4 acts. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Well, thank you very much for your kind invitation to come and speak with you. It's really interesting, I have to tell you, and I'm really enjoying my stay here. I walked around campus a little bit, and it's a beautiful campus, and John, you absolutely blew my mind. And there has to be a connection between ritual and relevance realization. And you completely distracted me because I started thinking all about that, and now I'm not thinking about my presentation at all. My presentation seems to just pale in light of that connection that there must be. So anyway, but all right, good enough. Yes, Ritually Shaping the Imagination is my title, the subtitle, Humanity in 4 Acts. And I really do mean that. I sincerely believe that it is ritual that is largely responsible for Homo sapiens being here right now, holding conferences such as these, and not Neanderthals or dolphins or chimpanzees or any other possibilities. Since this conference is focusing on cognitive science and religion, I thought it appropriate to talk about those aspects of the mind, especially the developing human mind, that make it particularly amenable to religious concepts. Hence my 4-act play. Imagination is adaptive, Act 1. Act 2, supernatural imagination is childish. Act 3, ritual molds childish supernatural imagination into adult religious belief. And Act 4, in the end, it is ritual that inherits the earth. Okay, first we have to define our terms, and here's how I'm defining ritual. Here's how I'm defining imagination. See, I'm distracted. Relevance. Here's how I'm defining imagination. It is the ability to create situational models unconstrained by the realities of the immediate present. And a shorthand for that is to simply say alternative situational models. So with imagination, I am able to mentally envision a model of how the world could work, how things might be organized, how they might operate, and this model could be wildly at odds with the constraints of reality, or it could be fairly realistic. The important point is that imagination entails the mental construction of an alternative to what is present, concretely present in the here and now. Obviously, imagination is central to religion and religious thinking because gods and spirits and mystical powers, heaven and hell, and all of those other concepts that are so central to religion are not the sort of thing that most of us ever directly see or encounter. We envision them. Supernatural imagination is that specific aspect of imagination that is most directly relevant to religion. And here I list 4 characteristics of it. Supernatural agents exist, and they possess suprahuman powers, such as omniscience, magical power, and a special access to and concern about our moral behavior. Promiscuous teleology. The universe and life are purposeful, and there are purposeful powers that control our destiny. Immanent justice. Ultimately, the world is a just place. Good is rewarded, and bad will be punished. And finally, essentialism. This is that there is some immutable essence that defines all things, including humans. In humans, this essence takes the form of soul, which transcends materiality and therefore death. I'm going to come back to supernatural imagination later. For the moment, let me remain with just imagination in general and talk about its adaptive value. I keep breaking things down into fours in this talk, so I'm going to have four important adaptive functions of imagination, and here is number one, mental simulation. By envisioning alternative situational models, we can let our minds suffer the potential negative consequences of our actions rather than our bodies. Envisioning potential danger and thereby avoiding it, or planning and strategizing to achieve potential benefits could both prove highly adaptive. Number two, understanding unseen mediating causal forces, which is a mouthful. What does that mean? Well, the wind blows and an apple falls from the tree, but there is a mediating causal force at work here, and that is the branch shaking. Thus, if one understands the importance of this mediating causal force, one can bring it about in an alternative and potentially more direct way. That is, just go up and shake the branch yourself. Okay? And so understanding this mediating causal force can make you more effective in dealing with the world. Okay? However, now, some mediating causal forces are unseen. They are not readily perceivable. Suppose that you are a chimpanzee and you're trying to get access to some fruit. You can use a rake to pull in the fruit, but one of the rakes has firm blades, and I'm going to do a little pointing here, and one of them has flimsy blades, and I'm just referring to this graphic right here. This was taken from a number of conditions that were used in this experiment, but I'm only interested in D here for the moment. So you've got these two rakes. One of them has flimsy blades, one of them has firm blades. You can easily see that the firm-bladed one is going to be more effective in pulling the fruit towards you than the flimsy ones. However, and this is pretty obvious to see when it's held up like this, so that you can see the flimsy blades flopping around there. However, when placed horizontally on the ground with the blades outstretched, the firmness or the flimsiness of the blades is not readily detectable. Anthropologist Dan Pavanelli found that if he simply straightened out the flimsy blades, the chimps would just as readily attempt to use that rake as they would the firm-bladed rake, even if they observed the entire process. They had a hard time keeping in mind the critical but rather obscure causal property of rigidity, which was present with the one rake but not with the other. Now, among social species, one of the most prevalent and critical unseen mediating causal forces is, of course, another's mental state. By understanding another's intentions and goals, we may be in a better position to offer aid and thereby reap the benefits of being an effective cooperative partner, or one might be in a better position to gain advantage on a competitor. Interestingly, while chimpanzees often fail tests of unseen physical causes, such as the rigid versus flimsy rake test described earlier, they often pass simple theory of mind tests, especially when done in naturalistic settings, such as when two chimps of different ranks are vying for food. And here is the setup for that sort of study or that sort of test. The subordinate chimp over here can see that the dominant chimp over here can't see that there is food behind these barriers, and therefore the dominant chimp doesn't know that that food is present in the room. When let loose, the subordinate will immediately fetch the food that the dominant does not know is present. Now, this has led Michael Tomasello to argue that understanding unseen mental states precedes the understanding of unseen physical causes. If so, this leaves open the possibility that understanding the unseen mental states of unseen and possibly supernatural agents also precedes the understanding of unseen physical causes, and indeed, this was proposed by Reichert and Smith not too long ago. Thus, and maybe somewhat ironically, understanding the gods may have been an intermediate step toward a better causal understanding of the natural world. A third adaptive function of imagination appears to be social skills. On numerous measures of social intelligence, children with greater imagination score higher than those with less imagination. For example, children with imaginary friends, and there seem to be a rather large proportion of them cross-culturally, have been found to be less shy, more sociable, more expressive, and they have been found to outperform peers on theory of mind tests. Additionally, children who engage in more imaginative play have also been found to score higher on theory of mind tests than those who show less imaginative play. They also have been found to show a greater understanding of how the thoughts and emotions of others can vary with situational factors, and they tend to get higher likability and sociability scores from peers and teachers. The positive effects of imagination are not just restricted to children. Studies have shown that adults who regularly read fiction outscore their exclusively non-fiction reading peers on numerous measures of social intelligence. And I guess this is where the antisocial professor image comes from, since we're all reading non-fiction stuff and then don't know how to get along at a cocktail party and that sort of thing. A fourth adaptive function of imagination is something called HAD, the hyperactive agency detection device. This is the tendency to assign agency based on minimal evidence. So the slightest rustle or disturbance in the basement is assumed to be the creep of a threatening prowler. Our tendency to hear voices in the wind, to see faces in the clouds, to assume predators lurking in the shadows may all to one degree or another be attributed to HAD. And while this may make us more tense and paranoid than is necessary, many have argued that it is actually quite adaptive, since missing a truly dangerous agent just once could carry a very high fitness cost. Now, HAD has become quite popular as an explanation for our religious tendencies. Over-attributing agency seems to provide a handy explanation for the widespread assumption that gods and spirits and ghosts and other unseen supernatural agents exist. And no doubt HAD plays some role here. But I think many researchers overplay HAD. There's plenty of evidence, I think, for an analogous form of HAD in many other species. Rabbits are notoriously paranoid. Cats will treat any moving thing as prey. Dogs can be embarrassingly liberal with their amorous assumptions. And monkeys form strong emotional attachment to comforting but quite inanimate cloth-covered moms. Yet despite all of this non-human HAD, there's absolutely no religion among non-human species. Furthermore, HAD provides no explanation for why our supernatural agents seem to universally possess the particular characteristics that they do, such as omniscience, moral concern, and immortality. Nor does it explain other universal religious concepts, such as the soul, the purposeful universe, and heaven and hell. So the adaptive value of imagination gets us started toward understanding the religious mind, but it leaves many things unexplained. A fuller explanation requires that we look at religious thinking ontogenetically. Religious imagination traces many of its specific qualities to childhood's supernatural imagination. And that leads us to Act 2 of my play. Act 2, supernatural imagination is childish, or the ontogenetic origins of supernatural imagination. Supernatural imagination is childish, and I do not mean that in any pejorative way. Instead, I simply mean that supernatural imagination, like many other aspects of cognition, is early emerging. We find evidence of it from infancy on into early childhood. For example, 3-year-olds have the general tendency to over-attribute knowledge to just about everyone. In other words, they think that everyone has godlike mental powers, which actually is good for parents for a while at least. But by age 5, it starts to lose some of its usefulness. By age 5, kids are beginning to gain a better grasp of the limitations of human minds, realizing that they can misperceive things, they can entertain false beliefs, they can be subject to deception. However, while they are busy placing limits on human minds, they are continuing to attribute superknowledge to God's mind. Barrett and Reichert have argued that this amounts to a kind of mental preparedness for religious forms of thinking. God's mind is actually easier for kids to conceptualize than human minds because it falls at the default setting for minds. Magical causation is also another fairly easy concept for children to grasp. Magic or supernatural causation does not contradict or compete with natural causation. Instead, it is the cause for unexplainable things. Studies show that children invoke magic when an event seems to violate the ordinary rules of causation and/or when no natural cause to an event seems readily available. Interestingly enough, it is often the youngest kids who are the most committed naturalists and older kids that more readily appeal to supernatural causes. One study that supports this developmental trend was done by Baring and Parker, a rather well-known study, done by Baring and Parker in 2006, and it's the famous Princess Alice study, and there is the famous Princess Alice. In this study, what Baring and Parker did was they had 3 and 7-year-olds, and 3 to 7-year-olds. They were told that the spirit of Princess Alice might help them in selecting the correct box where a ball was located. Children selected a box, and then strangely, the lights in the lab room would flicker or a picture would fall from the wall. Now, what did all these strange events mean? Here's a summary of the results by age. All right, for the 3-year-olds, it all had perfectly naturalistic causes. The lights were wired badly. There was a bad nail in the wall or something like that. For the 5-year-olds, yes, it was Princess Alice, but they really didn't know what it meant. Okay? The 7-year-olds put it all together. Really a good act of, integrative cognition here. It is Princess Alice, and she's trying to tell me that I picked the wrong box. 2 things seem to happen as kids gain a greater knowledge of physical causation. The total number of unexplained events goes down, so in total, appeals to non-physical causation decrease. However, for those violations that appear to remain, their potential supernatural significance can be more greatly appreciated. So it is only when you understand a physical law, like that thoughts and desires cannot affect physical things, that you're in a better position to imagine the significance of that law's potential violation, that this is now a message from a supernatural agent. That older kids might actually be more prone to appeals to the supernatural was demonstrated nicely in a recent study by Woolley and colleagues. They presented 8 to 12-year-olds and adults with hard-to-explain scenarios, such as the spontaneous remission of cancer, and found that supernatural explanations increased with age. And there you see it on the graph. The supernatural appeals to the supernatural are the dark bars there, and they tend to go up as the kids get older and are at the greatest amount for the undergraduates that they had in this study. As with magical thinking, imminent justice thinking also appears, wrong slide. Religious people often have faith in a just God. This is nothing new for children, who naturally tend to see the world as a just world, which is referred to as imminent justice. Jean Piaget was one of the first to document how children naturally tend to connect the fault that has been committed and the physical phenomena that serves as punishment. Furthermore, these punishments are assumed to be automatic and emanating from the things themselves. So when Piaget had children explain why a bridge collapsed in a story that he presented to them, the children explained that it was because the child on the bridge had earlier stolen apples. Now, as with magical thinking, imminent justice thinking appears to fill a certain conceptual niche. Children are more likely to use imminent justice logic when the motives and the outcomes match. So in other words, a person with a bad motive gets punished, or a person with a good motive gets rewarded, and when the cause of the outcome was ambiguous or hard to explain. Thus, if a clear alternative physical explanation for an outcome was not forthcoming, the children often built a moral connection between the outcome and the earlier behavior. It was also Piaget who was one of the first to point out how children frequently read purpose and intention into natural events, something which has been referred to as promiscuous teleology. When asked why the wind blows, children would say, well, so I can fly my kite. Or in the case of Charlie Brown, why does the tree eat my kite? Because it hates me. And no doubt it hates him for some moral transgression that he committed earlier. Teleological thinking persists even in the face of adult opposition. If you ask children why rocks are pointy, they will explain that that is so animals won't sit on them, a position that they will maintain even after being informed that most adults prefer naturalistic explanations, such as rocks are pointy because of erosion. This preference for teleological explanations naturally tends to lead to creationist forms of thinking. Children from both fundamentalists and non-fundamentalist Christian households have been found to prefer God as an explanation for the origin of species rather than natural selection. And this shouldn't be too surprising. Studies with infants as young as 12 months of age show that they have a natural assumption that human-like agents will create order and natural forces will create disorder. When shown a display of a human hand moving toward an array of blocks, the blocks are strewn about randomly, the infants expect the hand to order the blocks. Indeed, they will show surprise if the hand appears to take an ordered array of blocks and turn them into a random mess. However, infants will show exactly the opposite pattern if you replace the human hand with an inanimate claw. Agents create order. It makes sense, then, that a super agent created the order that we see all around us in the natural world. A final important tendency of childhood thinking that easily scaffolds religious thinking is essentialism, the idea that categories are defined by some immutable quality inherent to the category members. So if you take a horse and you paint it up as a zebra, and you teach it to behave in every way as a zebra, the child will tell you that that still does not make it a zebra. It's still a horse. It has a horse's soul, so to speak. When applied to humans, then, this essentialist thinking easily leads to notions of an immortal soul, which possesses the unchanging essence of what it means to be human. All right. And so we reach our entra acta, which was, I picked that up because that's what they have in the middle of, what is it, Ben-Hur? If you ever, get Ben-Hur, and they have so it must be the middle of the show, so there you go. And here at the entra acta, we have a broad outline of the origins of the religious mind. Okay? Phylogenetically, religious imagination emerges simply because imagination itself is adaptive. Ontogenetically, religious imagination arises quite naturally from the supernatural imaginative tendencies present from early childhood on. With little training or indoctrination, children readily accept that unseen agents abound. These unseen agents have suprahuman powers. Magical causation explains the unexplainable and highly improbable events. The world is purposeful and just, and we all have an immortal soul. All right, that moves us on to Act 3 of my play. Ritually molding childish supernatural imagination into adult religious belief. Or, another way to put it, ritually outlining the serious supernatural. Supernatural imagination is not religious belief. To create religious belief out of supernatural imagination requires ritual. Rituals serve the general function of specifying what is normative for a community, including normative beliefs. By performing rituals targeted at certain aspects of the supernatural, the community outlines for a child that of the supernatural which is to be taken seriously. The cross and the soul are part of the serious supernatural. Flying sleighs and leprechauns are not. Furthermore, as we will see, ritual often entails costly, non-utilitarian behaviors, meaning behaviors that require considerable time and effort but seem to accomplish no practical goal. Such behaviors, however, specify values and they give credibility to beliefs. One reason why ritual is extraordinarily powerful in transmitting normative values is because it begins so early. Our first encounters with caregivers are ritualized interactions. The early turn-taking exchanges between mothers and their infants are social interactions that possess all of the critical elements associated with rituals, such as attention-getting signals, rule-based behaviors, and formalized and repetitive gestures. These are emotionally powerful experiences that bond infants not only to their moms, but to the norms and the values that mom and her community embody. My father was a proud Army officer, and I can remember him regularly getting out the Brasso and the Kiwi shoe polish to polish up all the buttons and medals and black leather of his uniform. The odd thing about this little ritual was that to my untrained eye, all of the stuff being cleaned and polished looked pretty cleaned and polished before he even started. But that is one of the important qualities of ritualized behaviors. They are obviously intentional, repetitive, rule-governed behaviors that seem to accomplish nothing, at least nothing in any practical utilitarian sense. But it is this intentionally useless quality that is critical to their meaning and their power. A young boy watching his father clean and polish an obviously dirty uniform interprets the act mundanely. He did it because it was dirty. A young boy watching his father clean and polish a clean uniform interprets it morally. He did it because he values the uniform. The uniform, and whatever it is that it stands for, is serious. So it is when kids see adults doing other clearly intentional but seemingly useless behaviors, such as repeatedly kneeling before altars, praying before meals, or reading and studying the same book over and over again. The message is clear. These things are serious. These are part of the serious supernatural. Often these useless behaviors force participants to incur real costs in terms of time, energy, money, or physical risk. For example, 5 times a day, a good Muslim must stop what he is doing and pray. Similarly, for Orthodox Jews, where thrice daily prayer is required. Christians are only required to attend weekly services, but the reduced time cost is often offset by monetary costs, the old passing around the plate tradition. Sometimes religious rituals involve more direct physical costs or risks, such as the snake handling practices of Appalachian Pentecostals, or some Hindu rituals involving body piercing with hooks and skewers and needles and so forth. These costs, however, have been shown to add credibility to the values and beliefs underlying the rituals. They wouldn't put themselves out like that if it really didn't mean something. Now, how does a kid react when he sees all of these intentionally useless behaviors being performed in his proximity? The kid imitates. The fact that kids imitate is hardly news. What's interesting, though, is that children sometimes over-imitate, meaning that they faithfully replicate causally irrelevant acts. So, if an adult waves a stick over a box 3 times before opening the box, the child will do the same, even when the child is fully aware of the fact that the stick waving plays no causal role in the box opening. Now, what triggers this over-imitation? The answer appears to be ritual. The acts most likely to be over-imitated are exactly the ones that specify the presence of ritual, ones that are intentional, repetitive, rule-based, and causally useless. The tendency to over-imitate can be very stubborn. Recent studies have shown that kids readily distinguish ritualized gestures from those that are simply causally inefficient, and when helping another achieve a practical goal, they will retain the ritualized gestures while omitting the causally inefficient ones. It may also be relevant that this hypersensitivity to ritualized acts firmly establishes itself at around the same time that kids are just beginning to appreciate the distinction between human minds and God's mind. One of the reasons why young children are so sensitive to ritualized actions is because they interpret those actions as signifying normative behaviors, behaviors that they ought to do. By age 3, kids are already enforcing group norms on others. By age 4, they are connecting ritualized actions with group norms. They demonstrate this connection by protesting when someone fails to over-imitate, even if a practical goal has been achieved without the use of the causally irrelevant acts. So, for example, if someone opens a box without waving a stick over it 3 times, the child will protest and say, "That's not the right way to do it." Thus, it appears from the ritualized act, children have encoded a normative rule. This is how we, meaning our group, performs this act. Oops. The urgency to meticulously and faithfully imitate useless ritualized acts is heightened if kids are anxious about group membership. Show kids a video of geometric forms seemingly ostracizing another from the group, as these are doing here. These are nice geometric forms. They're allowing the other one to come into the group. Okay? So you show a video such as this, and what happens afterwards? The accuracy and precision of children's imitative acts increases. All right. So, the developing human mind's natural inclinations are toward supernatural beliefs. Ritual provides a powerful mechanism for shaping those beliefs in group normative ways. The child enters the social scene saying, "I know supernatural agents are out there. I know the world is a just and purposeful place, and I know that we all have some immaterial essence." The adult social world responds with rituals that give these vague childhood notions specific emotion-laden content. Justin Barrett has argued that this developmental interaction between mental predispositions and cultural practices strongly suggests a sensitive period for religious development, similar to that found for language. This period is somewhere between 5 and 7 years of age, when many of the important milestones concerning the development of theory of mind, over-imitation, and ritual participation are occurring. During this period, specific religious beliefs are planted in the fertile soil of a mind already primed to accept such ideas. Furthermore, these ideas are invested with deep emotional significance because they are ritually transmitted using the same processes that bond infants to caregivers. Attachment to the caregiver entails attachment to the religious beliefs, values, and concepts of the caregiver and her community. These beliefs, values, and concepts are then given normative and credible standing by virtue of the costly ritual acts associated with them. And now, Act 4. Ritual inherits the earth. At one time, we were all pretty convinced that Homo sapiens held a significant cognitive advantage over other hominids, especially Neanderthals. This position has been significantly eroded by recent archaeological evidence indicating the presence of symbolic thought, cooperative hunting, complex tools, the exploitation of a wide variety of animal and plant resources on the part of Neanderthals, all qualities that were once thought to be unique to Homo sapiens. To To some archaeologists and paleoanthropologists, this supports the notion that the demise of the Neanderthals and the subsequent survival and domination of Homo sapiens was more a matter of chance or shifting climatic conditions than any substantive difference between the two species. I'm not entirely convinced of that, at least not yet. While the archaeological record seems to have blurred significant qualitative differences between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, an obvious quantitative difference remains. I should say it's obvious to me. I don't know if it's obvious to anyone else, but it's obvious to me. What is this? Intentionally fashioned beads, thought to have been used for body decoration, gift-giving, other various forms of ritual behavior possibly, have been found at both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens sites. But it is only at some, and to be clear, some, not all, Homo sapien sites that we find beads by the hundreds. And here are a few examples. At nearly every single Neanderthal site, the number of beads that we find is less than 10. There is one exception to that. There's some examples of Neanderthal sites and the number of beads that we found there. The one exception you see, Grotta du Rennes. This is in France, and this is 36. That's how many we found there. However, if any of you are familiar with the Grotta du Rennes site, you will know that it is one of those which has been dogged by controversy over the authorship of the artifacts found there. But even if we set aside those controversies and we include Grotta du Rennes as genuinely Neanderthal, it is still orders of magnitude less than what we're finding at some Homo sapien sites. My point here is that some Homo sapiens were not just practicing rituals, but they were engaging in costly rituals. A single bead may be just as symbolic to the owners as scores and scores of them, but the cost in terms of time, energy, and effort is far greater for scores and scores of them compared to just one or two. And it is costly behavior that gives credibility to whatever beliefs, values, and concepts lie behind the ritual acts. Likewise, consider for a moment burials. Okay. Now, to be clear, there are some archaeologists who would reject out of hand the notion of intentional Neanderthal burial. But let's set them aside and assume that some Neanderthal burials are intentional and reflect the presence of genuine ritual burial practices. For example, the Old Man of Chapelle-Auxence in France has been claimed by some to have been an intentional, ritualized burial with some tools found along with the body serving as grave goods or grave offerings. Chapelle-Auxence is about as ritualized as Neanderthal burial gets. There is simply nothing in the Neanderthal record that comes close to some Homo sapiens burials, such as Sungir in Russia, where 3 bodies were found, adorned with necklaces, bracelets, arm and headbands composed of thousands and thousands of intentionally fashioned beads. Other grave goods were also present, including tools and useless ivory weapons. I say useless because ivory is a relatively soft material and very impractical for hunting. It is estimated that over 10,000 hours of labor were necessary for the creation of these grave goods. Finally, consider the use of caves as ritual venues. During the Upper Paleolithic, which is about 35,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, we have scores and scores of examples of Homo sapiens venturing deeply, sometimes a kilometer or more, into dark, dangerous caves for artistic and ritual purposes. These ventures often took them across and through dangerous, treacherous streams, over sheer cliffs, down dangerous caverns, all the while carrying artistic supplies, torches, ladders, and often with young children in tow. The risks involved in this behavior are pretty clear, and therefore I think it easily qualifies as costly. We have but one example of Neanderthals penetrating more than 100 meters deep into a cave, and this is at Bruniquel in France. Now, the date on Bruniquel is 50,000 years ago, which puts it in the Middle Paleolithic. So I'm not going to compare it with any of these Upper Paleolithic cave penetrations by Homo sapiens. Instead, I'm going to compare it to a contemporaneous, roughly contemporaneous, Middle Paleolithic cave used by Homo sapiens in Botswana, Africa, and this is Rhino Cave. And for some archaeologists, Rhino Cave represents the first evidence of religious ritual in the archaeological record. Now, at Bruniquel, Neanderthals crawled through a very narrow passage going about 200 meters deep into the cave into a small chamber. They apparently, once in the chamber, they apparently broke off stalagmites and stalactites to form two circles on the cave floor, and they built a fire in the larger of the two circles. And there you see a depiction of what we find in Bruniquel. And some have argued that this was the venue for some kind of bear cult rituals of some sort. Although not as deep as Bruniquel, getting access to Rhino Cave is arguably equally as challenging. Homo sapiens crawled over and around large boulders, then navigated a steep, nearly 2-meter drop to get access to a small, dark chamber containing a large serpent-like outcropping, and there you see that outcropping. The outcropping has been intentionally modified to enhance its snake-like qualities, and in flickering torchlight is said to have the hypnotic appearance of undulating movement, quite conducive to the trance states common in shamanistic rituals. The snake rock, however, is not the only provocative aspect to Rhino Cave. The cave floor was littered with burnt and broken tools. The tools were exotic, meaning that they were made from raw materials brought to the cave from 100 kilometers away or more. These materials were brought to the cave, fashioned into completed tools, and then broken, burned, and otherwise destroyed, all in the cave. They never left the cave. What an extraordinary waste of time and energy. Utterly useless behavior. But of course, that is the whole point about costly ritual behavior. It is powerful by virtue of its seeming uselessness. Note well the critical cost differences between Rhino and Bruniquel. Homo sapiens brought materials to Rhino from considerable distance. They worked the materials in the cave and then destroyed them there in the cave. Neanderthals brought nothing, other than torches, I assume, into Bruniquel. Once in Bruniquel, they broke off materials that were already present and used those materials in the cave. For me, at least, what Rhino Cave, Sungir, the collection of hundreds and hundreds of beads and other evidence of costly non-utilitarian behavior suggest is that Homo sapiens, far more so than Neanderthals, were not just practicing ritual, but they were incurring a high cost in their rituals. And it is ritual cost that gives credibility to beliefs and values. It is costly ritual also that builds strong cooperative communities. And it may have been this social difference that made an important difference when the two species encountered one another in Europe tens of thousands of years ago. I started all of this by talking about the mind, but I'm going to conclude by talking about the power of ritual, and I do this because it is ritual that molds the mind and directs it to what is serious. Ritual molds our beliefs, endows them with emotional power and normative standing. And in doing so, it binds communities together. It makes what we imagine real, and that created reality transcends life itself. Ritual specialist Catherine Bell has argued that ritual is the way that we take biological inevitabilities and we turn them into cultural regularities. In other words, and these may be my other words, but I think they're good words. In other words, we use ritual to rob nature of the last word. Biology decides when we are born, but ritual decides when we are officially admitted to our communities. Biology decides when our bodies mature, but it is ritual that decides when our societies deem us men and women. Biology directs our lusts and desires, but ritual determines who our legitimate partner will be. And in the end, biology decides when we die, but it is ritual that decides when we are dismissed from the lives of our loved ones. Humans are the only species, I think, that are perplexed and even offended at nature's indifference to our circumstances and to our suffering. And ritual is the mark that we leave testifying to that offense. Thank you very much.
Very nice. Thank you. The microphones are filling up.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. Okay. We've got time, and the director has the first question.
Fascinating, thank you. I love the developmental perspective integrating into the question of ritual.
Thank you.
We have encountered in our study of language comprehension that kids have a bias towards deontic reasoning. So rather than interpret something, something like "I can swim" or "you must do something," there's two ways you can interpret it. You can interpret it as a statement of possibilities, or a statement of means. So you can say to go to the east side, you must take the subway, or where is John? Well, he must be outside looking for coffee. Children prefer strongly the obligation kind. You must do something because I'm telling you to do, because there is a norm, etc. And this comes up all over in language comprehension. We've interpreted it in structural terms.
Yeah.
The syntax-semantic organization of a sentence, of the deontic sentence, is slightly simpler than the probability type of statement. But it seems to fit with the whole set of cognitive biases that you've been discussing, that given something, we're more likely to reason in terms of obligations and norms,
Yes.
rather than assessment of statistical probabilities.
Yeah, well, I tell you, you raise an issue, and maybe I go a little extreme on this, but I think most of the, can you hear me, or do I need to, okay? I think most of the problems that we tend to give kids, especially in various sorts of developmental research and all that kind of stuff, we think it's a problem in physics, or we think it's a problem in logic, or we think it's a problem in language, or something like that. And I think most of the time kids are interpreting it as a social problem, all right? And they're looking for what's the right social answer. And so it doesn't surprise me at all in linguistics, if you're giving them, different kinds of language problems, they want to know, okay, what is it I'm supposed to do to be accepted as a good member of my group and my community? Yeah, and I think that constantly sort of comes through in a lot of developmental research. I mean, we think we're giving them physics problems. They're thinking, no, how do I answer these questions so that I fit in with my group, and that I'm a good group member, and that there will be protectors for me in this group, and people will care about me. I think most of the problems they confront, I think they interpret them as social problems and go from there.
I have three questions.
You get one.
I get one? Okay. What's the difference between obsessive compulsive disorder and religion?
That's your one.
Well, I guess just in general, for the vast majority of religious people, religion is a positive in their lives. It actually serves to help them function more effectively. For obsessive compulsive disorder, I guess I would argue that it's a disorder because it's inhibiting their functioning. And so just when we get down to functioning, the two things are having very different effects.
Hi, Professor. Is there a significant difference between the different cultures and religions on how they constrain the supernatural imagination of children? Or are the properties you listed, like promiscuous teleology, essentialism, are those universal properties that we observe cross-culturally?
I think it's safe to say that most religions have something in them that endorse that to some degree. There's so many religions out there, and when you start getting into traditional religions, the religions of traditional societies and hunter-gatherers and that kind of stuff, we only incompletely understand everything that's going on there. So you do have to be careful. Certainly when you start to get to what we think of as the global religions, the religions that have the sort of greatest acceptance and spread throughout the world, yeah, those are important themes. When you get to traditional religions, I think most likely you're going to see that there to some extent, but there's probably going to be a lot more variability as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for a lovely, oh, yep, please. All right. Thank you for a lovely address, Professor. I think we've all grown accustomed to the phrase, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. And I think that this effectively articulates a desire to discover a relationship with the transcendent without committing to a lot of the features of religion that you identified, especially ritual. A lot of people who seem to be looking for a spiritual connection and an understanding of the transcendent, in fact, seem to consciously avoid and perhaps even abhor a necessity of ritual or an adherence to ritual. Are these people who are looking for an understanding of transcendence through their spirituality engaging in a religious experience of the type that you've discussed today, or are they doing something that is phylogenetically and ontogenetically distinct from this, this childhood priming and evolutionary advantage of imagination?
Well, gee, a couple things to say on that. My guess would be that if you're engaging in some kind of spirituality that has no ritual component to it, first of all, I want to know, what are you doing in your spiritual thing, whatever it is? Because most people that say they're spiritual and are serious about it, okay? They're not just throwing that out there to sound, I don't know, politically correct, or, you know, they have a spiritual side. See, I have a spiritual side, even though I don't go to church, you know, that kind of thing. What are they doing? Because if they're actually doing something on a regular basis with their spirituality, I mean, I want to look at that, and I'm probably going to find ritual going on there. You know, I mean, if they're meditating, I mean, meditation, there are all kinds of ritualized practices that are associated with that. And, you know, are they praying or something, or do they have a particular room that they use to contemplate, or what? I mean, all of those things are components of ritual. So I'm not sure that you can, if you're really going to be serious about some kind of spirituality or spiritual practice, I'm curious as to how you do that without ritual elements. It's hard for me to envision that, but maybe it's there. I don't know. So, you know, it may be that one of the things that's happening there is that people naturally have those tendencies, I think. And maybe there was something about the person's experience in a more organized, you know, ritualized kind of institutional religious setting that was unsatisfying. And so now they're still acting on that, you know, those feelings and those general, those biases, only they're trying to act on it in a more individualized way. But again, how they're doing it would be interesting to me.
I'm kind of interested in how you use ritual to put the line between what we view as religion and supernatural, just imagination, so the supernatural imagination. And is that correct? Did I do that right?
Well,
yeah.
Let me make sure I understand you. I just want to make sure I understand the question. That's usually the biggest challenge for me, is understanding what are they asking.
So what I was interested in is we have this thing called religion, and you know, we follow a certain number of rules. People pray and stuff, but that's much different than if one person was doing it. So if one person was doing it, for example, the OCD that he said, we wouldn't put that aspect to it. How many number of people have to, you know, engage in this kind of ritual for it to become a religion? For example, you put up actually the Santa Claus and, you know, his elves. I think that is actually going to go on the right, because it's part of the cross and the soul. Because we do the rituals, and we have actually integrated the story of Santa Claus to Saint Nick, to religion. And it's gone so far that we do it in my first year biology. What we did was we looked at like little flies, and then we would, you know, or like beetles, and we would look at a feature, and then we would say, hey, why does it have that? So we would assign, they would teach us to imagine why it would be adaptable for that beetle. And that's how we do science even now. Like, where does ritual cut the line? Like, I don't see the line between a holiday and a ritual.
Try this. I don't think anybody's going to die for Santa Claus. But there are a lot of people throughout the centuries that have died for their religion. So there's a distinction there. There's a distinction in how seriously they take it. And I think it's the ritual practices directed toward Jesus or whatever that makes that serious to the individual. They see that people are expending a great deal of time, energy, and effort toward these concepts. They're dedicating themselves to these concepts in a way that they're not dedicating themselves to Santa Claus. Santa Claus is fun. It's fun to do Santa Claus every, Christmas and all that kind of stuff. But notice, you only can get Santa Claus to really be religious if you start making that connection back to St. Nick. And what was St. Nick doing? And why was he doing it? Now you start to bring in all the religious elements. You just leave Santa Claus out there as a completely secular thing, and he's fun and he's wonderful, but nobody's going to die for him. Right? They're just not going to take him that seriously. You might get people to start take Santa Claus that seriously if you start to get people to practice and direct regular kinds of ritualized behaviors toward Santa Claus. And they really start to sacrifice for Santa Claus. They start to engage in costly behaviors for Santa Claus. Then you start to think, what is it about this Santa Claus dude that is so inspiring and so interesting to people that, people will put themselves out like this on a regular basis. So that's... Okay,
but they do to put costs.
You just asked one sort of question, like, where do you draw the line? Like, if one person does a ritual, is that religion? Answer is no. At least not in my mind. Religion, separate from spirituality, religion is something that has to involve a community. Okay? I tend to see religion like language. Okay? You can't have a single individual that just has language. It has to be shared amongst the community. It's a community. The community owns it, in a sense. I think the same is true with religion. Religion is something that a community has to agree on. They have to have a set of beliefs, a set of practices, a set of morals, a framework. That's the thing that unites them as a community.
Thank you.
Firstly, thank you for that talk. It was made me rethink ritual. My first question, my only question is, when you say ritual is seemingly a waste of energy, is that tied into consciousness? But in a sense that we are aware that it's useless.
Oh, I don't think ritual participants think of it as useless. When I say useless, I mean useless in achieving some practical material goal. So, if I go out to mow the yard, I'm doing all kinds of behaviors. And I'm doing behaviors that are repetitive. I'm pushing the lawnmower, and then I'm turning and pushing the lawnmower. But in the end, I have done something. And you can look and you can see the material change that I have created. The lawn is now a lot shorter and more organized than it was before. It's hard to do that with ritual, to point to something that has been done, materially changed, transformed. I'm sure the people that engage in the ritual will tell you that they get something out of it. That somehow spiritually, mentally, these things have helped them. And so in that sense, there's a subjective feel of having accomplished something. But that is going to be, rather individualistic, and it's not something the scientists can really point to and measure all that well, although there are ways that we can, test, certain things like, I don't know, whether your mind has been cleared or that kind of thing. But from a practical standpoint, that's really when I say useless.
Okay.
And if a child is looking at it, the child is going, why are they doing that?
Yeah.
What has happened in the environment that's different because they went through all these actions?
So you do have to be a little bit aware that it's confusing, that it's kind of not energy that you should be using in a respect of efficiency. The last thing that I just want to quickly say is, do you think there are any other animals or species that have a similar behavior to ritual, as in they're expelling energy?
Here's where I have to make the distinction between ritualized behavior and ritual. Okay? There is a deep evolutionary history to ritualized behavior. Some very, very simple, species in terms of, organic complexity and all that kind of stuff. They have repetitive, stereotyped actions which convey a social message. That's, one of the ways to look at ritualized behavior. So one of the things that really intrigues me about ritual, why I think it's very powerful, is that it has deep evolutionary roots. We're not ritualized behavior has
Yeah.
deep evolutionary roots. So we're not creating something out of, unique whole cloth here. We're taking something that already has a very deep evolutionary history, and we're starting to augment it and add to it. And I think the thing that we add to it that makes it, that transforms it from ritualized behavior to ritual, is we start adding cultural components to it.
Okay.
Symbolism, tradition, hearkening back to the past, reminding us of our narrative, our mythology as a tribe, as a group, that sort of thing. And it invokes then values, priorities. This is what we stand for. This is who we are.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I guess we all understand that not all rituals are religious. Some rituals, add on to our well-being, while others do not. Take, for example, I guess this is a politically incorrect example, but the 9/11, for example, when people die for the wrong beliefs, for example, whether that topic is debatable or not. How would you configure or constrain rituals so as to improve well-being, both mental and physical, and to prevent illness?
Okay, so how would I would have, do I have some recommendations for making sure that ritual is positive rather than negative?
Yep.
Wow.
How do you optimize it?
Okay. I think that what ritual seems to do, okay, let me start there. What ritual, especially group rituals, and by the way, I don't think flying planes into a building was ritual.
No, take cults, for example, or these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Detrimental rituals.
Look. One of the important functions of ritual, especially community-wide, is that it binds that community together. Those individuals that engage in ritual together, they tend to cooperate with each other more. They tend to trust each other more. And so it has this effect of building strong communities. But you can use ritual for all kinds of purposes. So go back to the 9/11 for a second, okay? I'm pretty sure those guys probably engaged in certain kinds of ritualized behaviors as a way of preparing themselves for doing what they did. And in the end, we would say, it was terrible what they did, okay? But ultimately, what we're judging is we're judging the values and the framework that community has, that they are then using ritual as a way of getting people to commit to that framework. But I think what we're judging is not the ritual and saying that the ritual was a bad kind of ritual. I think what we're saying is that they used the ritual for an end that we think was an immoral, bad end. Look, the military uses rituals. I mean, that's one of the, why does the military have people go out and march? I mean, that's crazy today, to go out and march into the field of battle. No army does that. But military training involves marching in unison. Why? Because that's a unison, group, synchronized activity, ritualized activity that binds them together. Now, they're willing to die for each other. Okay? Now, the next question is, what are they dying for? Okay? I think that's a next step in evaluating all this.
Thanks.
So one of the themes that came up a couple times today has been that, at least among adults, many religious people don't actually hold these factive supernatural beliefs, but I imagine they still find rituals, even ones which involve these metaphors, to be extra meaningful. So you told us about the development in a child of supernatural beliefs and of ritual. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you think these two developmental trajectories are importantly connected, yes, or are they largely independent?
Oh no, absolutely.
Given that adults can have the one but not the other.
Okay. I mean, the connection between them was one of the big things I was trying to show, that what we're doing with rituals is we're taking things that are already in sort of vague form in children, and we're now defining them for them and directing them in particular ways. So I guess, are you sort of asking, can you have ritual without supernatural beliefs?
Like, if we didn't have a supernatural phase of development, would we still go through the ritual phases, or would it be unrecognizable?
Oh, we would, sure. If we didn't have any supernatural beliefs or supernatural imagination, we would still have ritual behavior of some kind, because ritual behavior is present across just about every social species. We would have to have behaviors to help us efficiently communicate with each other. Shaking hands and all the sorts of simple kinds of things that allow us to understand what our role is in some kind of social situation. Ritual is wonderful at that, telling people what their role is, communicating an important message about intentions and all that kind of stuff. So sure, you would still have that. What you would probably be lacking is, one of the things we have found is that religious communities and their rituals just tend to be more powerful in terms of binding the group together over the long run. If we compare religious kibbutzim versus secular kibbutzim, the religious kibbutzim beat them hands down. All the secular kibbutzim, they're pretty much folding up, or they're getting rid of most of their their isolation or their utopian ideas. The religious kibbutzim, the Orthodox kibbutz, they just keep right on going. And I think part of the reason for that is that it looks like if you're going to ask if you're going to extract costs from somebody, if you're going to say this ritual is going to cost you something, time, energy, effort, pain, okay, you got to give them a reason for why they're doing that, and the supernatural becomes a very compelling reason. Okay, more so it looks like than just purely secular kinds of reasons. Well, do it because it's good for you, or do it because it's good for our community, or do it for some ideal or something like that. Well, that will motivate some, but it looks like if we start doing comparisons, the reason why religion ends up being a human universal is because probably in our evolutionary past, secular groups with their secular rituals and religious groups with their religious rituals, they competed with each other, and who was more organized, who was which group's members were more willing to sacrifice, for the others. Religion is a human universal.
Would you say it's something like the supernatural belief?
Let's share the question.
Okay, so the answers from a while ago kind of messed up what I was going to ask, but because I wanted to ask how we know ritual gives meaning to what people believe. Ritual gives them the confidence to say that this is right. Ritual bonds communities together, and in doing so, in enforcing pro-social behavior, ritual also enforces anti-social behavior when people meet people with different sorts of rituals because their sense of identity is threatened. So now I'm thinking, how do we scale back fanaticism, knowing how ritual works, to reinforce it?
Yeah, good question. Let me say this. We always, we've done a lot of discussion of religion and in-grouping and out-grouping. First thing I'd like to comment on is to say that, there is an important function that tribalism and in-grouping and all this does. And that is, it picks out for us who we can trust. We may not like that, but that's true, okay? And until we can get universal trust, until we can sort of look out there and look at everybody and go, I can trust everybody, regardless of their background, how much I know them, what interests they have, what social clubs they're involved in, what political views they have. Until you can get everybody to look out there and ignore all that and go, I can trust everybody equally, okay? You're always going to have tribalism to a certain degree, okay? Because because you participate in the same rituals as me, because you believe the same things as I do, pretty much. When it comes to making judgments of who I'm going to trust, I go to you rather than the stranger. Right? So I get a little worried when we talk about, if we could make religion just so good, if we could just get rid of the tribalism. We could make humans just so good if we could get rid of the tribalism. But why haven't we? Because it's something very fundamental to our functioning. We have to figure out who we can trust. And religion has become one of the powerful ways over the course of our evolutionary history to figure out, I can trust this guy, I'm not sure about this guy. Okay? Now, how do you reduce that somewhat? Well, a lot of the global religions already have some seeds of that in them. I mean, they talk a lot about, and sometimes it's just talk, but they talk a lot about, we're all children of the one God, and there's no male, female, there's no Greek, So there's a lot of these things present, at least in the more global sorts of religions. That's one of the reasons why I think they've become global, is because they have elements in them that go against tribalism, But the problem is those ideals are always in tension or in conflict with the function of religion on the ground. And the function of religion on the ground is this is a church community. We can trust each other. We help each other. The guy outside the community, we got to do our best. We got to love and everything, but I'm not sure I can trust him. Hey, who am I going to have babysit my kid? You know? I mean, that's not one of those things where I want to do a test and try to show my universalism. Okay? I'm not willing to do it. I need somebody I can trust. Who's going to work on my car? Hey, I know the guy in my church. I know he's honest. What about that other guy? He may be fine too, and I love him just as much. But guess what? This can run into thousands of dollars. I mean, when you get on the ground, you have real challenges, okay? And these things aren't simple. So, you know, you try your best, I think, to elevate those ideals as much as you can, put them into practice as much as you can, recognize that what your religion does for you and what your rituals do for you, it's doing pretty much the same thing for the other guy. It's not that they're bad, they just have different rituals and stuff like that. That can be respected. So I guess you try to do things like that as best as you can.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Our questions are exploding faster than our time. We are going to stop.
Time is exploding.
Answers at 5 to 6. Keep going.
Hi. It's
Hi.
interesting that you talked about the social utility of rituals. I think a previous questioner asked about the function, the potential function of a ritual, perhaps moving beyond the social utility. So there's this Catholic scholar, Peter Craved, who mentioned that when you give time to God, God gives that back to you in multifolds. I was wondering if you can, maybe expand on your thinking in terms of its potential function beyond social utility. Perhaps a Christian who prays is imbued with the Holy Spirit, or a Buddhist who meditates gains a sort of a fine-tuning for the rest of his day, or something like that.
Okay. Have you read my book?
Maybe I should. Yeah.
Read my book. No. One of the big themes that I tried to bring out in the Supernatural Selection book is the idea that I think ultimately religion comes down to relationships. Okay? And there's levels at which these relationships operate. One relationship is the intergroup relationship amongst the believers in their community. Okay? But there's also the relationship between the individual and how they perceive the supernatural, and the group and how the group perceives the supernatural. But I think for most religious believers, these relationships, they aren't qualitatively different. I mean, they're relationships, ultimately. And one of the things that ritual does is that ritual helps to service the relationship. Rituals serve social functions amongst the humans that are doing the rituals. But rituals also serve a similar kind of social function for the individual trying to better know his God and have a better relationship with his God as he sees it. Ritual becomes the same sort of mechanism or vehicle for that kind of social bonding. That's
interesting.
Part of it as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
You can all blame me. This is the last question.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. A theme amongst the questions coming up here was how spirituality arrived out of the value from these useless rituals. So I was wondering, maybe just to clarify, do we see instances of spirituality arising when the action is only perceived to be impractical, but it serves a use for the practitioner?
Okay. I'm not sure I understand. So do that again?
Sorry, I'm a low talker. It's just the link of spirituality arriving out of the value that we have from serious but useless rituals. And just maybe to clarify that, going over if we do see, if we can say that instances of spirituality will arise when an action is only perceived to be useless but does still serve a purpose for the practitioner.
Okay, well, I think what useless rituals are doing is they're helping someone to understand what the content of their spirituality is supposed to be. So your spirituality, whatever it is, if you are using the ritual as some kind of means of developing your spirituality, that ritual is helping you to understand what is your spirituality about. what kind of God do you believe in? What are you expecting to get out of your relationship with that God? I think the rituals are helping to define those elements of it, so that you don't end up with just this vague, I worship nature because nature's big, but you have a clearer idea of what it is you're worshiping, or what it is you're trying, what it is of the supernatural you're trying to interact with, and what you think what the supernatural expects of you. Then, what kind of value system, morals or lifestyle that you think is compatible with this understanding of the supernatural, of your spiritual sense. And the ritual is helping to define those things, I think.
Thank you.
Okay?
So, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.